The boy in the nose never blinked. Ice rhymed his mask. He spoke into the intercom like a metronome. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. Now. The B-17 flying fortress did not wobble. It moved like a bridge through the sky. Hamburg had believed daylight meant safety. It did not. That July afternoon in 1943, Americans came through smoke and steel, tight as a parade, and dropped bombs on a city that thought it could not be touched when the sun was up. The target was not a street. It was a node, a shipyard, a power plant, a substation. Break the nerves and the muscles fail. That was the American idea, and it worked because a free country had the will, the training, and the tools to make the idea real. Everything that happened in that moment had been built the night before. Armorers hoisted ANM-64 and ANM-65 bombs into bays. Crew chiefs ran hands over hot Wright cyclone cylinders. Weathermen wrote wind arrows on chalkboards. A cook shoved eggs across a tin plate to a pilot who had slept 2 hours. In East Anglia, thousands moved like parts in a living machine. That machine reached from a Detroit assembly line to a Norfolk runway to a Norden site over Hamburg. People call it logistics. Americans called it Tuesday. Harry H. Crosby, navigator of the bloody 100th, said it plain. 3,000 men to put a few hundred flyers and 24 planes into the air. That is not a slogan. That is a civilization at work. The enemy fought hard. Buff 109 seconds came head-on at 12 o'clock. Fluffed 190 seconds dove from sun to smoke. Even twin-engine night fighters joined the day. Tracers stitched the air. Black flak puffs walked the formation. A fortress fell burning, and another slid into its place without losing the box. They threw up everything that had a propeller, one airman said later, and he was not boasting. He was describing a storm. The answer from American crews was discipline. Keep interval. Fire in short bursts. Do not freeze on the trigger. Trust the lead ship and ride the geometry. To the target. The geometry worked. The bombs went where they were told. On the ground, people felt the pressure first, then the silence. Engines crushed the air into a flat weight. Dust rose and did not settle. Windows trembled without breaking, then shattered at once. Water ran in the gutters, and then there was no water at all. The power failed in a building far from the blast, and men in that building learned the shape of American daylight, an attack built to make night worse. That is how you change a war with airplanes. You do not simply drop bombs. You steal time from firefighters and sleep from workers, and breath from a machine that keeps a city alive. In a single 24-hour cycle that week, RAF night bombers dropped roughly 2,300 tons on Hamburg. The next day, Americans came back in daylight and hit again. No country but the United States could have kept that tempo in 1943. Not in men, not in fuel, not in aircraft, not in training. The 8th Air Force could lose planes and still launch. It could rotate crews and still fill briefing huts. It could bend a doctrine and still keep precision. The result felt impossible if you were under it. If you were inside it, it felt like duty done right. Meet Staff Sergeant Joe Ramirez, a top turret gunner and flight engineer. He sat under the plexiglass blister and watched the sky like a hawk. He called bearings to the pilot, while swapping to a fresh oxygen bottle with his free hand. He smelled burnt paint when flak tore through the wing root. He tapped the fuel selector before the pilot asked. He did not panic when a fighter grew from a dot to a shark. He fired a short burst and saw the fighter peel away smoking. He had grown up near El Paso. He had trained in Texas heat and English rain. He had a mother who saved the telegram envelope in a drawer until long after the war. He did his job. That is the human shape of American power. Now slide back to the nose. The bombardier could not see the primary clearly through smoke. He made the call. Go to the secondary, a generating station, a target that feeds pumps and rails. He toggled the switches, waited for the exact line, and released. That is doctrine plus improvisation. It is not romance. It is competence. It is what happens when a nation teaches teenagers to hold a course through noise and fear. The bombs fell. Somewhere, a switch never closed again that day. Somewhere, a pump did not start. Somewhere, a U-boat's repair schedule slipped from today to never. In war, that is mercy for sailors you will never meet. The Germans were not fools. Their gunners were skilled, their controllers relentless. They filled the air with steel and hit hard. Parachutes opened. Men fell and landed in a city already breaking. Some became prisoners of war and learned another American truth. A democracy fights hard and treats captives with decency because it believes its own values even when angry. A guard might whisper that Hamburg was finished. A prisoner might answer nothing and think about home. The war had entered a new speed. The people under the bombs felt it in their bones. The people in the bombers felt it in the way the engine note never changed. This is why Americans should be proud. Not because war is pretty, it is not. Not because the enemy was weak, he was not. Pride fits because free citizens made a system that turned anger into precision and courage into results. Factories produced, schools taught, farms fed, docks loaded, workshops repaired, airfields launched. The chain had no weak link, and when one link bent, someone fixed it by dawn. No other nation could combine numbers, learning, and heart in the same week, on that scale, across an ocean. Hamburg learned that the hard way. America learned it by doing. If you want to see the picture in one frame, hold this in your head. A shiny aluminum wing over a dark river, snow-bright sunlight on a gun sight, a pilot holding a course while his mask ices, a boy in a nose counting down seconds, a bomb falling toward a square on a map, a city that had built walls learning that walls mean nothing to wings. That is what American daylight looked like. That is how you begin a story called Germans Never Expected US B-17 seconds would level Hamburg in 7 days of bombing. You do not warm up. You walk straight into the furnace and show how free people made it. Then you say this: "We are just getting started." The cellar door would not close. Hans-Erich Nossack pushed his shoulder into the wood and felt the building breathe. The roar came through the bricks like a heartbeat. He remembered parachute flares from the nights before and called them Christmas trees because they hung and glowed and turned streets into strange daylight. Now the sun was actually up, and the light had a different weight. It was whiter, thinner, meaner. Dust lifted and held in the air like cotton. People did not shout. They moved without voices, carrying children or nothing at all. The city did not feel like a city. It felt like a ship in a storm. The storm had 2 names and 1 rhythm. At night, the RAF set the table with Pathfinder flares and heavy bomb loads. In the day, the United States took a scalpel to the city's nerves. Power, rail, shipyard, engine works, yard cranes, switch yards. The point was not spectacle. The point was to make every hour after worse for the defenders. That rhythm is the simplest proof of American advantage. Daylight precision demands training, formation discipline, and a supply line that never blinks. The 8th Air Force did it while building for even bigger jobs ahead. The RAF did its job with iron faith and tonnage. Together they made a hammer and an anvil. Together they broke a proud port. Inside one B-17, a lead navigator kept time with a pencil. Wind drift. True heading. Turn at the initial point. He trusted numbers while the world outside turned to smoke. He had read the brief at dawn in a hut that smelled like coffee and damp wool. He had watched the operations officer draw a chalk circle around Blome and Voss and the generating plants and say, "This is where the city moves." He had thought about the Atlantic convoys that had bled because U-boats were repaired here. He had thought about seamen frozen on dark water who never got a grave. He whispered a promise into his mask without knowing he said it. 3,000 men to get 210 flyers and 21 planes into the air. The sentence is simple. It carries the entire American method inside it. Bomb hoists, spark plugs, fuel bowsers, ground radios, cooks, medics, weather officers, clerks, runway sweepers. Replacement engines stacked in depots like loaves in a bakery. Lots of nations are brave. Only one in 1943 could deliver bravery with an invoice, a timetable, and a spare part number for every piece on the field. That is how you sustain daylight war. That is how you go again tomorrow. The Luftwaffe was not idle. Fighters slid in head-on because that was where the big bombers were weakest. Flak shells burst at 20,000 feet because that was where the bombers liked to fly. Pilots with little sleep and great skill tried to break the box. Sometimes they did. Often they died. A fortress is not a castle. It is an airplane with men in it. But a box of fortresses is a moving fortress wall. The guns cross. The pilots hold line abreast. The gunners fire in measured bursts, so barrels do not warp. A fighter dives and finds 50 cars waiting from 3 directions. The pilot pulls, rolls, curses, maybe flames. The box moves on. Nossack wrote that refugees brought an uncanny silence. You can hear that silence in your head if you let the engines fade for a second. Steps on ash, a hand on a door, a woman holding a pan because she forgot to put it down. Men who cannot say where they are walking and so they just walk. The shock was not from one bomb. It came from the tempo. It came from waking to ruin, working to stop it. And then watching, more bombers arrive while the hoses lay limp and the lights were out. That is strategy turned into human feeling. Americans did that not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. End the war faster. End the killing at sea. Break the machine that fuels the weapons. Hear a second voice from the sky. They threw up everything that had a propeller. No adjectives, no poetry, the kind of thing a man says when he is too tired to dress the truth. That is the feel of the day battle over Hamburg. It was violent. It was ordered. It was repeatable. The repeatable part is what broke the back of German hope. Lose a dozen bombers and still come tomorrow. Patch holes and still launch. Brief at dawn and be home by afternoon with film cans for the photo boys. Learn. Adjust. Tighten formations. Shift to secondaries when smoke hides primaries. Every turn of the wheel makes the next turn easier. Meet another American. Lieutenant Jack Moran, bombardier. He lived because a German medic dragged him from a canal after flak cut his parachute and threw him into the water. He became a prisoner of war. In the first week behind wire, a guard whispered that Hamburg was finished. Moran stared at the ground and said nothing. The guard was not boasting. He was admitting that the thing he believed was strong had been broken by a nation he had never visited. Moran later told a Red Cross man that the hardest part of capture was not fear. It was missing the next mission. That is a strange sentence. It is also true. American airmen felt that way because they trusted the system that sent them. If you need a fact that tops the last one, take this. On the most terrible night, winds turned to fire and fire turned to wind. Temperatures spiked to levels that made streetcar rails twist. People were pulled toward flame by a force that felt alive. By daylight, the United States hit the very things that kept hoses working and trains moving. When you remove power from a city in crisis, the fire grows teeth. When you cut rail, the city can't move its wounded or its equipment. When you smash cranes, the U-boat fleet loses its spine. That is round-the-clock war. And the American part is the daylight precision that makes night decisive. Now hold the picture. Smoke towers rise. A silver wing edges through like a compass needle. Below, men fight a fire without water pressure. Above, boys from Kansas and New York and El Paso hold formation. The enemy looks up and sees not only airplanes but a schedule. He realizes resistance is now a math problem he cannot solve. That is the moment when belief moves from propaganda to reality. Why daylight? Why risk men in the open when night hides you? The question is fair. The answer is American. We could do what others could not. We trained men to fly in boxes so tight a wingtip felt like a handshake. We built bomb sites that could put steel on a switchyard through haze. We created a pipeline that fed crews, fuel, engines, and aircraft even after losses. We paired that daylight scalpel with a night hammer. Hamburg became the proof. The city did not fail because of one raid. It failed because of a week in which the sun and the moon both served the same purpose. Break a war machine so the war ends sooner. Walk into a dawn briefing hut. The operations officer draws on the map with chalk. Blom and Voss. The generating station. The big switchyard. He circles the places a city cannot live without. He says words that sound like engineering and mercy at the same time. Hit here, and the night will burn hotter. Hit here, and U-boats stay tied up. Hit here, and the pumps fall silent. A young navigator copies headings and times and writes the initial point in block letters. He isn't a poet. He is a craftsman. His craft is turning a continent's production into a straight line through the sky. Now build the line. In the States, factories turn out B-17 airframes like clockwork. Willow Run does the same for the B-24 every 63 minutes. Ships carry fuel and engines across the Atlantic. Depots stack spares. Airfields eat them and ask for more. England gives the runways and the weather and the welcome. America gives the flood. This is how you make daylight precision more than a phrase. You stop being romantic about bravery and start being relentless about process. You count spark plugs and you count minutes. You put 1,000,000 small tasks in the right order and call the result victory. The Luftwaffe tries to break the order. Head-on passes, vertical dives, cannon shells that explode inside a wing, flak walls that bloom at the exact height the Americans prefer. The Germans are brave. They are good. They are also late. Daylight raids that repeat break more than metal. They break cadence. They force maintenance into panic. They push pilots to fly when they should sleep. They demand fuel. The Reich cannot spare without starving someone else. Americans did not set out to break men. They set out to break systems. Systems keep men alive. When systems fail, the men know it first. A German civilian writes down what he sees without adjectives. He notes refugees walking as if sound is dangerous. He notes a room so bright from flares it looks like noon at midnight. He notes a night when thunder and bombs and flames blur into one noise that swallows thought. He does not lie to himself. He understands that something new is happening. He senses the rhythm of it. Hammer at night, scalpel by day, hammer again. He hears the day engines and understands that the city will not get the 12 hours it needs. He understands he is living inside a schedule, and the schedule is American. Put a name on the nose. Lieutenant Howard Cromwell, pilot. He comes off oxygen with a nosebleed and jokes that the price of seeing Germany is high. He tells a reporter later, "They threw up everything that had a propeller." He is not bragging. He is admitting respect. He knows the men who aimed those guns were fast and clever and deadly. He also knows his crew did the impossible routine. They held course when it made no sense. They believed the lead ship mattered more than fear. They trusted a kid with a bomb sight more than their own eyes. Courage is not only charge and shout. Courage is hold and wait. Now answer the question we posed at the start. Why daylight? Because only the United States could make precision repeat. Because precision by day multiplies terror by night. Because cutting power in daylight turns fire into wind and wind into a weapon. Because breaking a switchyard at noon makes a midnight city unable to move. Because smashing cranes at lunch makes a submarine sit cold at dawn. Because a free nation can fly into flak at 20,000 feet, lose airplanes, land, rearm, repair, and still brief again tomorrow. That is how you end wars sooner. That is how you save sailors you will never meet. Meet a prisoner of war who never lost his dignity. Lieutenant Jack Moran again. Captured after flak cut his chute. A German medic saved him from a canal. Behind wire, a guard whispered to him that Hamburg was finished. Moran said nothing. He stared at mud and thought about the next mission he would not fly. He felt shame, not for being captured, but for missing the work. That is a strange feeling. It is also American. It comes from trusting a nation that keeps its promises even when you are not there. Food will arrive, planes will launch, friends will fly, The job will get done. Now stack the numbers until they feel like thunder. In one day and night slice of the week, RAF bombers delivered roughly 2,300 tons. Americans struck by day within the same cycle. Across the operation, tens of thousands of homes burned, power failed, rail knotted, and industry stalled. The U-boat repair spine buckled. The Luftwaffe bled pilots and fuel for daylight fights it could not avoid. The city's will bent. This is not a boast. It is a chain of cause and effect. When you can deliver mass and precision together, you change the physics of war. Picture the last seconds of a run. The nose glass is a window into a burning maze. The bombardier cannot see the primary. He slides to the secondary and holds his breath. The ship does not move. The navigator counts down in a voice as calm as a church bell. The toggles click. The airplane lifts a little as the load falls free. The pilot holds the line 2 seconds longer to keep the string straight. Then he banks the heavy bird like a dancer and points for home. That is the American answer. It is not pretty. It is not cruel. It is necessary. It is effective. It is freedom turned into math and nerve. We end this turn with the same sentence the enemy learned the hard way. Daylight was not a gap. Daylight was the blade. The Germans never expected fortresses to fly through smoke and flak and still hit the heartbeat of a city. Americans did it in a week and then kept going. Eddie's hands never stopped moving. He was 19, skinny and deadly serious, as he lifted an A&M 64 500-pound bomb into a B-17s bay under floodlights that turned the pierced steel planking into a silver river. He checked the arming wire twice, tugged the safety, and called up to the crew chief, who answered with a pencil behind his ear and a tired grin. 4 right R-1820 Cyclones coughed, then settled into a heartbeat thrum. On that cold July night in 1943, the line on an English airfield felt like a factory floor that made only one thing: tomorrow's daylight over Hamburg. A mechanic slid under a wing and ran his fingers over yesterday's shrapnel patches. He knew which riveter worked fast and which worked neat. He knew the airplane like a living thing: oil temperature, boost pressure, the way a stubborn magneto woke up reluctant. He tightened a clamp and tucked a pencil note into the pilot's map case. In another life, he would be in a small Ohio garage. Here he kept a flying fortress fit to fly through flak, again and again and again. That is how Americans win wars, through hands that do small things right all night, so that big things can happen at noon. In the briefing hut, a weather officer drew arrows across the North Sea, winds at altitude, freezing level, contrails likely after the initial point. The navigation chief sang headings like a hymn. The operations officer circled Blome and Voss, the generating station, the switchyards, and said the sentence the 8th Air Force lived by: hit the nerves, and the muscles fail. There were no speeches. There were instructions. The American way in July 1943 was simple and ruthless. Understand the task, build the tools, trust the team, execute, adjust fast, and come back tomorrow. The hook that morning was Eddie from Kansas, a kid who had never seen an ocean until the army sent him to England. He carried a box of fuses like eggs. When a pilot thanked him, Eddie always answered, "Sir, I like my birds coming home." That line is the American system in 10 words. A free boy with responsibility in his hands, knowing that strangers in the sky depend on the unseen work he does in the dark. That is the heartbeat behind Daylight over Germany. Anonymous excellence, serving men whose names you never know. On the perimeter road, flatbeds stacked with A&M 65 1,000-pounders rolled slow under blackout. Bomb service trucks eased into place. Armorers heaved, pinned, safe-tied, and counted. Counting mattered. Too short on a ship meant failure. Too extra meant death. At the fuel dump, a corporal watched numbers climb as a Bowser fed avgas through cold hoses. Pounds, gallons, minutes to engine start, every young American on the line could read the math of victory and knew his column had to balance before the sun came up. Across the sea, Luftwaffe pilots tried to sleep. They were good and brave. and they would claw into the sun to slash head-on at the American boxes where the guns converged the least. They would try to tear the fabric of the formation and make the pieces easy to kill, but they could not touch the thing Americans did while they slept, the system in the dark. A crew chief fixing a magneto at 2 a.m., a clerk logging serials and hours, a medic laying out morphine syrettes because he knew what a flak burst did to aluminum and skin. The invisible half of daylight war is what makes daylight possible. Harry H. Crosby, navigator of the bloody 100th, put numbers on it. 3,000 men to get 210 flyers and 21 planes into the air. People quote that line because it's clean. It's also a photograph. See Eddie's grease, streaked hands. See the cook pushing a tin plate across a counter to a pilot who slept 2 hours. See the weather officer's chalk arrows, the Nissen hut's damp walls, the clipped American voices calling checklists in the dark. This is not romance. This is organization turned into courage at altitude. The pilot climbed the ladder into his B-17 Farads and ran a glove across the yoke like a man greeting a friend. He knew the airplane's habits, the heavy feel of the landing gear on cold mornings, the right rudder nudge needed in climb, the way the de-icer boots complained at altitude. He also knew the faces on the ground, the crew chief with the pencil behind his ear, the armorer with the quick grin, the kid from Kansas with the listening ear. He buckled in, ran the checklist, and spoke the words without drama. Drama wastes oxygen. Discipline brings men home. Wheels up. The field fell away. The formation built in layers, groups finding groups, boxes locking together until the sky looked like geometry. They climbed into the lanes the weather officer had promised would be there. Over the North Sea, P-47 Thunderbolts swept the approaches and peeled when range said they must. The bombers kept going. Inside, the navigator tapped a pencil as the air thinned. The radio operator checked code sheets and touched the little square of chocolate he saved for the ride home, the top turret. Gunner scanned 12 o'clock high and felt the ship's skin vibrate under his elbows. Here is the part that still makes people shake their heads. In that week, Germans later called the firestorm, the Allies didn't fly one great blow. They flew repeated, scheduled, interlocking strikes. At night, pathfinders lit the city. Heavies followed with tonnage that would have staggered any nation 20 years earlier. By day, Americans returned with the scalpel to slice power, rail, and ship support while the city was still reeling. Round the clock wasn't a boast. It was a schedule printed in grease pencil and kept like a promise. A German civilian wrote that refugees brought an uncanny silence, as if sound had been used up. That silence moved in columns through streets where windows fell inward and water pressure died. It wasn't only fear. It was the sense that time had lost order. Morning should bring relief. Night should bring sleep. Neither did. Men in uniforms looked up and realized American airplanes were not an event. They were a system. Systems do not stop because a gun crew scores a hit. Systems absorb the hit, replace the part, and return on time. Meet Sergeant Marie Everett, a stateside-born radio operator who never fired a shot and helped win a war. She sat at a table in a Nissen hut with headphones clamped tight and a pencil sharpened to a needle. She kept a grid of call signs in her head like a map of the night sky, cross-checked positions, relayed last-minute wins, and listened for the clicks that meant a crippled ship was limping home on one engine. She sent an extra weather update that shaved 5 minutes off a bomb run. 5 minutes can mean the flak burst is set at the wrong height, and 5 minutes can be the difference between letters home and folded flags. The enemy's shock grew by the hour. They had been told the Reich's walls were thick enough, the flak belts deep enough, the fighters fierce enough. They were. And still, the fortresses came. Damage reports piled up next to damage inflicted on the other side. A battery commander looked at his brave, deafened crews, and then at the Silver Rose holding line and rhythm like a marching song. He understood the problem wasn't ammo. It was math and fatigue, and the Americans owned both. The run ended the way a good story ends clean. The bombs fell in a straight string. The ship lifted, suddenly light. The pilot threw the fortress into a hard turn that felt like dragging a barn by one corner. In the intercom silence that followed, men remembered to breathe. Back on the field, Eddie heard the rumble gathering and grinned without looking up from his toolbox. "Sir, I like my birds coming home," he said to nobody in particular, and laid out fresh plugs for the next engine change. Tomorrow was already on the board. That's how a free nation fights, with hands that never stop and a schedule that never breaks. The bombardier's world narrowed to a circle of glass and a moving crosshair. Smoke boiled ahead. A church steeple slid left, a canal glinted, and the straight line from initial point to target held like a taut wire. The B-17s' nose guns rattled, then stopped. The pilot took his hands off everything but trim and faith. The top turret gunner called a fighter at 12 high, and the engineer answered, "I've got him." The ship did not flinch. In that spell of seconds, American training and American nerve became a picture. A 5-man ballet guiding a ton of steel to a square on a map, while the air tore itself apart around them. He couldn't see the primary. Too much smoke. He flipped to the secondary, a generating station that fed pumps and rails, and breathed once through a mask rimed with ice. Bombs away. The ship rose a hand's width, suddenly lighter, and the pilot held straight 2 heartbeats longer to keep the string clean. Then the fortress rolled, hard left, and dove for the river like a man ducking under a swinging door. They had hit something essential. You could feel it in the way the city seemed to exhale. This is what sets Americans apart in 1943, doctrine and improvisation, living in the same cockpit. Brief the primary. If smoke blinds you, hit the backup that makes the night worse for the enemy. Teach 19-year-olds to execute a math problem at 20,000 feet, with frost on their eyebrows and flak bursts walking the air. Train them so well that the checklist runs like a prayer. Pair that cockpit with factories that never sleep and depots that stack spare engines like loaves in a bakery. That is how a daylight idea becomes a daylight result. The Luftwaffe threw its best. BF 109 seconds and FWO 190 seconds came in head-on, where the big ships were weakest. Twin-engine night fighters, dragged into the sun, fired rockets from outside the box. Flak pounded at the altitude the Americans preferred. A fortress fell, and another slid into the space it left without breaking the square. They threw up everything that had a propeller, one airman said, not as a boast but as a weary truth. The answer from the 8th Air Force was a thing that sounds small and turns out to be everything. Keep interval. Meet Staff Sergeant Joe Ramirez, top turret gunner and flight engineer. He wore gloves cut open at the trigger fingers and could swap an oxygen bottle with one hand. He fired in short bursts, called bearings for the pilot, and tapped the fuel selector before the pilot asked. Once, a shell tore through the wing root and painted the blister with burnt lacquer. He sniffed char and counted to 10 before speaking, because men listen when you stay calm. He had grown up near El Paso. He had trained in Texas, heat and English rain. He did his work without a shred of theatre and kept 9 other men alive through it. Below, a control room darkened without a sound. A pump stalled. A switch yard lost teeth. A crane that would have moved a U-boat hull tomorrow stood frozen. This is the quiet part of war that makes the loud part matter. You can't fight a fire without water pressure. You can't send a relief train if the rails are twisted and the signal's dead. You can't repair a boat if the crane will not lift. Americans aimed daylight at the things that made nights survivable, and the nights turned into wind and flame. A German civilian wrote of the uncanny silence that refugees brought into courtyards and stations. You hear that silence in the small sounds: shoes on ash, a hand on a door, a pan carried for no reason but habit. People did not curse the sky. They watched it. They realized what had changed. American airplanes were not an event. They were a schedule. You could set your fear by them. When fear becomes a timetable, morale breaks in ways maps cannot show. On the way out, the nose filled with tracers. The chin guns hammered again. Steady, short, disciplined. Steady. the bombardier said to nobody, and the pilot laughed once because he was already steady, because that was the only way home. Over the North Sea, the radio operator finally ate the square of chocolate he had been saving since morning. It tasted like ground coffee and brass and victory. The engineer checked the oil again for the 5th time and pretended not to see the blood on his glove. The crew rolled to a stop on the hard stand. Eddie from Kansas was already waiting with fresh plugs, clean rags, and a flashlight. "Sir, I like my birds coming home," he said to the pilot, who looked younger on the ground than he had in the air. The pilot squeezed Eddie's shoulder and said, "Me too." A clerk with red-rimmed eyes took the times, the rounds, the fuel, the damage, and the words, "Secondary hit solid." A photo truck carried the strike film away. A chaplain walked by and tipped his cap. A medic checked a thin cut on the radio man's hand and said, "You'll live." The system breathed in and out and got ready to do it again. In a single 24-hour slice of that week, RAF dropped roughly 2,300 tons at night, and the United States hit again by day. That is not a metaphor, that is a supply chain speaking out loud. Only America could build the training pipelines, ship the fuel, replace the aircraft, and rotate the crews so that daylight became a daily certainty. The enemy threw everything he had and watched the schedule stay on the wall. The B-17s' engines ticked as they cooled. Somewhere far off a siren wound down. The crew climbed out one by one, sore, hungry, and quiet. The bombardier looked back at the nose glass and ran a thumb over a smear of oil like it was a friend's cheek. Tomorrow's target wasn't written yet, but the math was already working. Eddie stacked his tools and whistled a tune he only knew half of. The sun slid under a low lid of cloud. The line never slept. America had another day to win. The question sounds simple and dangerous at once. Could any other nation in 1943 have done, in daylight, what the United States did over Hamburg? The problem is not only courage. Plenty of nations are brave. The problem is logistics plus learning speed. You must replace losses while increasing strength. You must train crews faster than you lose them and still make them good. You must deliver fuel, engines, and bombs to wet airfields across an ocean and do it on a schedule that fits the weather and beats the enemy. You must keep doing it after a bloody day. That is the problem. The answer is America. Start in Michigan. Ford's Willow Run turned out a B-24 Liberator about every 63 minutes at peak, a rate so fast it felt like science fiction turned into aluminum. In Seattle and Long Beach, assembly lines, worker-marched wings, fuselages, and tails toward factories that smelled like cutting oil and victory. Stateside depots, stacked engines and propellers, as if they were grocery stock, Wright Roan 1000, 820 seconds. Pratt & Whitney Roan 1000, 830 seconds, numbers on crates, numbers on forms, numbers that made airplanes breathe thousands of miles away. Merchant ships carried that breath to British docks, where cranes hoisted it onto flatbeds in rain that tasted like iron. Now stand on the edge of an English field at 0400. Armourers swing ANM-64S and ANM-65S into bays and call out counts. Fuel bowsers feed Avgas through freezing hoses while a corporal marks gallons without looking up. Weather officers chalk winds and contrails on a board. A training pipeline gunnery ranges in Texas, navigation huts in Colorado. Heavy bomber schools grinding day after day pushes men forward to fill crews whose names are already written on tomorrow's order. The 8th Air Force isn't a unit. It is a continent funneling will into wings. The objection comes fast. Daylight is too costly. Head-on fighters. Flak walls timed to 1,000 feet. Crews not yet seasoned. Can you sustain it? That is the problem's cruel edge. America's answer is that only scale plus process makes precision repeatable. Only a nation that can fly today and grow stronger tomorrow can choose daylight on purpose. Daylight changes more than maps. Daylight cuts power when firefighters need it. Daylight severs rails when hospitals need trains. Daylight makes the night's fire into wind. That is why we risked it. That is why it worked. Listen to a voice from the ground. A German civilian wrote of refugees who brought uncanny silence, of nights when flares hung like Christmas trees, and of mornings when engines returned without pity. That is not propaganda. That is a witness saying the thing the enemy felt in his bones. The raids were now a schedule. Schedules are made of parts and people. America sent both until clocks broke. Men who fought under the swastika could handle terror. They could not fix broken time. Numbers settle the argument. In the week we call Operation Gomorrah, Allied aircraft flew thousands of sorties and dropped roughly 9,000 tons on Hamburg. In one 24-hour window, night, tonnage exceeded 2,300 tons, and American daylight strikes hit within the same cycle. On July 25, B-17 seconds assigned to Hamburg pushed through smoke and flak. The next day more came back and hit again. Losses were real, but the line did not break. Guns were cleaned. Holes were patched. Engines were changed. Briefing huts filled before the sun cleared the hedges. Meet Lieutenant Jack Moran, bombardier turned prisoner. Flak cut his chute. A German medic pulled him from a canal and saved his life. Behind wire, a guard whispered that Hamburg was finished. Moran stared at mud and said nothing, then told a Red Cross man, "The hardest part of capture was missing the next mission." That sentence is pure American steel. It sounds crazy until you know the men, the crews, the system. He believed his country could finish the job without him, and it did. Stateside, mothers read about Willow Run and shook their heads. One bomber, an hour? Impossible until you stand under the shadow of an assembly hall longer than a city block. On docks, cranes swung crates of spark plugs and de-icer boots as if they were sacks of flour. In England, ground crews opened those crates and turned them into flight-worthy ships by supper time. At night, electricians fixed runway lights while cooks washed coffee cups. Somewhere, a clerk in a Quonset hut typed an engine serial into a ledger and made the next day's sortie possible. America wins by making little things matter. The Luftwaffe saw the shape of it and felt the trap close. Head-on passes cost pilots and fuel the Reich could not spare. Night fighters dragged into day died in sunlight. Flak crews grew exhausted. Battery commanders marked hits on plotting boards and knew in the quiet of their own skulls that they were measuring a tide, not a storm. You can fight a storm. You endure a tide until it drowns you. The Americans were the tide. In 1943, the United States shipped so much aviation gasoline to the United Kingdom that some airfields burned off surplus with flare pots rather than let tanks overfill before convoys arrived. Wasteful? No. It meant the system ran faster than the enemy could slow it. It meant a fortress could taxi at dawn, even if a truck bogged at midnight. Redundancy is mercy when men are counting on propellers to turn. And remember the people. Eddie from Kansas hauled fuses and said, "Sir, I like my birds coming home." A navigator from Brooklyn drew lines on a map with a ruler he never used in high school. A radio operator from Iowa adjusted a frequency with frozen fingers and saved a crippled ship's bearings. A German medic pulled an American from a canal and proved that decency can live in hell. A guard whispered the truth of his own city's defeat to a prisoner he could not help admiring. War is numbers. Victory is numbers plus people who choose to matter. So could anyone else have done daylight like this in 1943? No, not because others lacked courage, because only America fused industrial scale, training speed, logistical depth, and a moral certainty that precision was worth the risk. Only America could lose a dozen fortresses on Monday, launch another mass on Tuesday, and grow stronger by Friday. Only America could treat prisoners well on Wednesday and still hammer a dictatorship on Thursday. The schedule held. The tide rose. Hamburg proved the answer in fire and ash, and the United States wrote it in daylight for the world to read. The first woman we meet is carrying a pan she forgot to set down. She steps into a courtyard that looks like a coal mine at noon. Her face is grey with dust. She hears engines before she hears herself breathe. The sound is a weight that presses words flat. She does not shout. People around her do not shout. They move the way people move after an earthquake, slow and exact, as if noise could break whatever is still unbroken. They look up at a sky that has been bright at night, and now is bright by day. Christmas trees, they had called the flares that hung over their roofs. Today the light is harder. It belongs to the sun, and to the silver wings that hold a line no city wall can bend. Across the water and up in the clean air, Americans hold that line. The 8th Air Force flies not to punish a city but to cut its nerves. A bombardier in a B-17 steadies a crosshair and refuses to blink. A navigator traces the final turn at the initial point with a pencil that taps like a watch. A pilot keeps his hands on trim and faith. A top turret gunner lets a fighter swell from a dot to a shark and fires in short, wise bursts. If the primary is smoke, the crew does not blink. The secondary, a power station, a switchyard will do the same job. Make night worse, deny the enemy time, keep pressure a living thing. When bombs fall into that plan, they don't melt a city. They break a machine. They break it where it hurts. On the river, heat breathes. Wind starts to move the way a living thing moves. People feel it in their ankles. They do not have numbers for the temperature that cooks the air or the way fire invents a storm inside a city. They have steps, doors, hands, and a path that runs wherever others are running. The roar changes shape. A tram line shrieks as rails twist. Water coughs once in a pipe and dies. The night crews, brave and bone-tired, stand under a sky that has not stopped speaking since last evening. Then the day engines climb from the west and speak again. This is the impossible part for the defenders. There is no 12-hour pause. There is only a wheel that turns without mercy. On the English field that made this day, the wheel spins because of hands. Armourers with blackened knuckles hoist ANM 64S and ANM 65S until their backs ache. Crew chiefs check magnetos in the wet dark. Weather officers draw arrows and erase them. Cooks slide eggs onto tin plates for men who slept 2 hours and will not see noon if luck chooses the other side. 3,000 men to get 200, and 10 flyers and 21 planes into the air. That sentence is the American secret written plain. Everyone in the chain believes his piece matters. Everyone in the chain is right. That is how a free people turns anger into a schedule. A German writer will later say, refugees moved with uncanny silence. You can feel that silence when the engines fade for a minute. Shoes on ash, the thud of a bucket set down on stone, a door that does not close because the building has learned to breathe. There are no speeches in that sound. There is only the knowledge that something has changed shape and will not change back. The people inside the storm are competent. Fire crews run lines, medics move calmly. Soldiers on gun crews bleed from their ears and keep loading. The Luftwaffe flies hard. Fighters slash head-on. Night fighters stumble into daylight. Flak walks the sky in black flowers. Americans keep coming anyway. They keep interval. They keep time. They do the count and the check and the turn and the run the way they practiced in Texas and Colorado and the English rain. Meet an American who has no ribbon rack and still saves lives. Sergeant Marie Everett sits at a radio table in a Nissen hut. Headphones clamp her skull tight. She listens to code that sounds like hail on a tin roof and hears fear inside it. She copies wins again and sends them again, because 5 minutes shaved from a bomb run can make a shell burst at the wrong height and leave a crew alive. She never fires a shot. She sends the breath crews need. When a crippled fortress limps home low over the hedges, she is the first to know and the first to stand up. Meet a prisoner. Lieutenant Jack Moran fell into a canal when flak cut his chute. A German medic pulled him out and saved a stranger because that is what a human being does. Behind wire, a guard tells the American that Hamburg is finished. Moran says nothing and looks at mud. He tells a Red Cross man later that the pain is not fear. The pain is missing the next mission. That sentence is American and strange and exactly right for a nation that counts on itself. He knows the system will move without him. He hates that it can. He loves that it must. Here is the fact that makes people whisper, "No way," and then nod. In one 24-hour slice of this week, RAF heavies dropped more than 2,300 tons at night, and American B-17 seconds came by day to hit again. It is one thing to write that. It is another to stand under it or fly through it. Only one nation in 1943 could build a daylight instrument that sharp, and then play it every day until the work was done. Not bravado, not slogans. Training, fuel, spare engines stacked like bread loaves. Boys who learned to hold a course when fear tells hands to shake. A German battery commander watches the silver boxes hold shape after one bomber falls away and another slides into the space. He marks hits on a plotting board with a chin that buzzes from concussion and knows, in the quiet part of his head, that he is not fighting a raid. He is measuring a tide. He can be brave. He can be skillful. He cannot order the sea to stop. That is the American difference made visible. A schedule is a promise. America keeps it. When the day turns toward the North Sea, the air inside the B-17 tastes like brass and frost. Men remember how to laugh. The radio operator finally eats the square of chocolate he has saved in a breast pocket like a medal. The pilot dips a wing to look once more at a line of smoke that has no end. Back on the field, a kid from Kansas lays out fresh plugs and says, "Sir, I like my birds coming home." To the cooling metal, he is already counting for tomorrow. The wheel does not stop. It will climb. It will turn. It will drop. It will prove, hour by hour, that a free nation can do what no one else can do, and do it until the impossible looks like routine. The map said the city was here, but the view from the nose was a world of smoke. The bombardier slid his gloved thumb along the toggle switch and waited for the run to settle into that quiet that happens in the middle of chaos. The B-17 shook, then steadied. The pilot took his hands off everything but trim. The navigator's pencil clicked against his board like a metronome. The ship's heart was loud and even. Up front, the sight's glass turned fire into math. When the crosshair made sense, the boy in the nose did the job America had taught him to do. He could not see the primary. The stack at the shipyard was a black ghost. He shifted to the secondary the way a switchman shifts a rail. The generating station was a square of darkness that mattered more than any one building on a street. He breathed once. He spoke the word. Bombs away. The airplane rose a hand's width like a man relieved of a secret. The pilot held straight for 2 more heartbeats because keeping a string clean saves lives. Then he threw the Fortress into a left turn that felt like dragging a barn around by one corner and pointed for a river that showed pale silver through the haze. Precision did not mean perfect. It meant disciplined. It meant a plan you could adjust without losing the plot. Brief the node. If smoke eats the node, hit the backup that makes the same system fail. That is how daylight feeds night. Cut power at noon, and the fire that starts at midnight grows teeth. Sever a switchyard and morning trains do not run. Smash cranes and a U-boat spine stays bent. People sometimes think courage is noise. In a B-17, courage was the way a crew fell silent when the bombs were coming off. It was the way they trusted a 19-year-old to hold a line through flak walls and fighters slashing head-on. The Luftwaffe did what professionals do. BF 109 seconds came at 12 o'clock where the big ships were weakest. FOI 190 seconds carved down out of Sunday. Even night fighters, pulled into daylight, fired rockets from just outside the box. Black puffs marked altitude like a ruler made of smoke. One fortress fell burning. Another slid into the hole it left, and the shape held. They threw up everything that had a propeller, one airman said when someone asked him later what it felt like. It felt like that, and like frost in your mask, and like a trigger you pull in short bursts because you trust your training more than your fear. Below, men at a power station watched needles fall and knew the city they loved was about to learn what it meant when pumps die. A dispatcher at a rail yard stared at a board that had lost its lights and felt the weight of minutes turn into hours that could not be recovered. A crane operator pulled a lever that suddenly did nothing and looked at his hand as if the fault were in his fingers. They were brave. They were calm. They were also trapped inside a machine that someone else was now turning off one piece at a time. Strategic talk lives in books. The smell of a hot switchgear panel and the taste of ash tell the same story faster. Up in the box, the top turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Joe Ramirez, wore gloves with the index fingers cut open and a headset that pinched. He called a fighter at 12 high, saw it roll, and fired a 2-second burst. He swapped an oxygen bottle with one hand and tapped the fuel selector before the pilot asked. He had grown up near El Paso and learned that staying calm makes your voice carry farther on the intercom. He had learned to trust a ship's vibration the way a farmer trusts soil. He looked down through the blister and saw a line of smoke that didn't end. He did not call it victory. He called it work done right. The enemy's shock lived in small admissions. A battery commander who had trained for years looked up at silver geometry that closed ranks after loss and realized he was counting, not stopping. A fighter pilot who had been fast all his life hit the wall of a box's crossing guns and had to roll out because speed could not bend math. A civil defense officer watched water pressure die and saw a street that could not be saved and understood that the day's attack had already written the night's fate. Competent men felt their competence wasting, and that is what real dominance looks like. You do not humiliate the enemy. You make his best irrelevant. Americans did not invent miracles. They built a schedule and kept it. They produced bombers in factories that smelled like oil and hot aluminum. They shipped fuel across an ocean and stacked spare engines like loaves in a bakery. They taught boys to fly into black flowers and hold course and go again tomorrow. That is the part that still makes people whisper. Not the tonnage, though the tonnage was incredible. Not the flames, though the flames ate streets. The part that stuns is the repeatability. Brief, launch, form, penetrate, bomb, turn, return, debrief, repair, sleep a little, repeat. A German writer will try to explain the way the city learned to walk without speaking. He will remember flares that looked like holiday lights and acted like a map for destruction. He will say thunder and bombs and flame became one sound. He will not add exclamation points. He will not need them. His quiet voice is the best witness. It tells us that a new kind of war happened over Hamburg in a week that felt like a year. It tells us that daylight and night together make a pressure no wall can carry. It tells us that time itself can be a weapon when a nation has the will and the tools to use it. The fortress leveled out over the North Sea. The radio operator finally ate the small square of chocolate he kept like a charm. The pilot rolled his neck until it popped. The navigator drew one more line on a map already crowded with pencil ghosts. The gunner flexed his hands and felt the ache of a trigger pulled clean. They smelled oil and burnt paint and cold metal. They heard the engines settle into a sound that felt like home. On the field, a kid with grease on his face laid out fresh spark plugs and sang half of a tune and told the airplane under his breath that he liked his birds coming home. Tomorrow was already on the wall in grease pencil. The wheel kept turning. America kept its promise. The question at the heart of Hamburg sounds simple and brutal. Could bombing truly break a modern city's ability to fight fires, move the wounded, repair warships, and keep its people believing tomorrow will be better? If the answer was no, then daylight attacks were a waste of brave men. If the answer was yes, then daylight was a blade worth carrying through flak and fighters. The Americans framed the problem, measured it, and answered with a system. They did not guess. They tested the city's nerves by day, while the RAF hammered at night. They counted tonnage and sorties. They listened to crews. They watched photographs that showed rails bent, cranes frozen, transformers black. Then they went again. Start with power. A generating station is not a building. It is a heartbeat. Cut it at noon and the night coughs. Pumps fail. Hydrants spit, then die. Firefighters skilled, brave, doomed by physics run lines into streets where flame makes its own wind. In Hamburg that wind became a monster. Asphalt softened. Rails screamed. Temperatures rose until air itself seemed to burn. People felt the pull in their ankles as the fire created its own storm. None of that is drama added after the fact. It is what happens when a city that burns every night, loses power and water during the day. Now the rails. A switchyard looks like a board of lights when it lives. It looks like a black map when it dies. Daylight bombs turned boards black. Trains did not move. Aid did not arrive. The cranes that should have lifted U-boat hulls stood idle because a city can only do so many things at once, and survival uses everything. The Germans were not incompetent. They were outnumbered by physics. The Luftwaffe bled pilots trying to break the boxes. The flak belts hit and could not alter the schedule. The defenders learned that you can fight courage. You cannot fight time you do not have. Meet a witness inside the wire. Lieutenant Jack Moran, an American bombardier, went into the canal when flak shredded silk. A German medic hauled him out and saved a man he might have hated. Behind a fence, Moran listened to a guard whisper that Hamburg was finished. He said nothing because truth needs no echo. Later he told a Red Cross man that missing the next mission hurt worse than the bruise on his ribs. That is a line people do not forget. It is not bloodthirst, it is belonging. He trusted his country to finish the run without him, and he wanted to be where the work was being done. Meet a German civilian whose pen is steadier than most hearts. He wrote that refugees carried silence as if it were luggage. He wrote that the sky at night looked like winter holidays until the flares dropped, and then the city learned new meanings for light. He wrote that thunder, bombs, and flame became one wordless noise. He did not cheer or beg in the pages he left us. He told the truth. That truth is not a boast for anyone. It is a record of pressure applied with skill until the system under it breaks. Here is the hard number that answers the opening question. In one 24-hour period of the week, the world calls Operation Gomorrah. Night bombers dropped more than 2,300 tons on Hamburg, and American B-17 seconds struck by day in the same cycle. Across the week, thousands of sorties carried roughly 9,000 tons. About 250,000 homes were destroyed. Roughly 1 million people fled or were driven from their neighborhoods. Tens of thousands died in the firestorm night. The United States did not cause those numbers alone. But the United States made the night worse by cutting the city's muscles while the sun was up, and that is what answered the problem. Daylight can break a modern city's ability to fight. Daylight can make night decisive. The Possadito. Luftwaffe learned a second answer in blood. Head-on passes cost fuel, and men the Reich could not replace at the rate America built and trained. Night fighters dragged into sun died in a sky that showed every mistake. Flak gunners fired until their ears sang and their hands bled, and the silver lines still closed ranks after every loss. Commanders filled plotting boards with honest numbers that did not add up to hope. The enemy's surprise became the enemy's knowledge. Resistance was brave, often brilliant, and finally futile against a schedule married to industry. Americans did not celebrate. They debriefed. They changed fusing. They altered altitudes. They tightened boxes. They learned to shift from primary to secondary without losing discipline. They refined escorts and timing. They put every lesson into the next morning's briefing. That is what dominance looks like in real life. It is not a poster. It is a learning curve tied to factories and docks and the faith of a free people who fund, fuel, and feed the machine without asking for parades before the work is done. A small story shows the large truth. A crew chief walks the length of a returned fortress and counts holes. He taps a patch that held. He writes a number on the cowling in pencil. He looks at a boy in a leather jacket who is trying not to shake and says, "You did good." He lays out fresh plugs. He cleans an oil stain with a rag that used to be a shirt. He tells the airplane, not the pilot, "I like my birds coming home." He believes tomorrow will be better because he is going to make it better with his hands, and because a nation that can make one bomber an hour when it must can also make one more chance for the same crew to live. The city the Americans left behind when they turned for the sea was not only rubble, it was a broken clock. Fires burned at hours when water did not run. Trains stood still at times when the wounded needed moving. Work crews assembled under orders and found they had no tools that mattered because electricity is a tool and the wires were dead. People walked with quiet on their faces because quiet had become a load to carry. A regime that promised order delivered only smoke. That is how moral facts and material facts meet. A dictatorship that despised freedom learned that the free can organize, learn, and outlast. The Americans head home over grey water. The RAF lines up again in darkness. The wheel turns, the schedule holds. The problem we asked at the start has an answer now, and it belongs to a nation that blends heart and hardware. Could daylight break a modern city's ability to fight and save lives elsewhere by ending a war sooner? Yes. The United States proved it by doing it, measuring it, improving it, and doing it again. The coffee was still warm when the crew chief chalked a new mission number on the cowl. Engines ticked, jackets steamed, and the line swelled with the sound that became a habit. Fortresses starting for another run. This was the American edge. No pause, no breath, no see you next week. By dawn, armourers were already swinging ANM-64S and ANM-65S into bays. By briefing time, navigators tapped pencils over headings that would thread smoke and flak. By wheels, up, the 8th Air Force had turned night's terror into day's precision. One country could keep that cadence in 1943, and it flew from damp English fields with lunch in cloth bags and courage behind oxygen masks. A radio operator, hands shaking from cold, rechecked the wind message before the initial point and pushed it to the lead ship. That correction was minutes, and minutes were life. Flak fuses burst high, fighters arrived late, the run stayed straight. The United States won by stacking small right things until the impossible became routine. The enemy never lacked bravery. He lacked time, and America took time away. The run over Hamburg showed the mechanism. RAF heavies dropped roughly 2,300 tons in a single night. The same, 24 hours carried a US daylight strike that hit the city's nerves, generating stations, switchyards, ship support. If smoke smothered the primary, crews slid to a secondary without losing discipline. If a bomber fell, the box closed ranks and the shape held. If fighters slashed head-on, 50 seconds lit the air in measured bursts, and the pilot kept interval because the geometry was stronger than fear. They threw up everything that had a propeller, one flyer said. The answer was not a boast. It was a schedule. Technical Sergeant Ruth Carver, a stateside weather specialist, folded into the ETO pipeline, plotted the freezing level, and argued, politely and stubbornly, for an altitude change that kept contrails thin until the IP. Her numbers saved crews she would never meet. When the first fortresses came home with holes like windows in their wings, she counted them and went back to the board to make tomorrow safer. That is the American system. People who feel responsible for strangers and act like it. To the battery commander on the ground, the shock was arithmetic. His gunners were good. Their ears bled and they kept loading. The bursts bloomed at altitude, and still the silver rose slid forward, bomb doors open, hearts steady. He understood he was fighting not a raid but a production line, and production lines do not scare. They deliver. He could not order his clocks to stop. Round-the-clock pressure did more than break brick. It broke plans. Daylight cut power and rails. Night turned flame into a weather system. Morning returned before hoses refilled and crews slept. By week's end, the city was not just damaged. It was dislocated in time. Pumps coughed at noon and died by dusk. Trains stood where orders said they should move. Cranes waited for current that never came. Dominance was a metronome no one could silence. Americans debriefed with calm that reads like audacity. Move altitude up 500 feet. Tighten boxes, one ship. Shift aim to the western yard if smoke chokes the river run. Lessons walked from film can to chalkboard to flight line. A clerk scratched serial numbers and fuel totals by flashlight and made another day possible. The nation that built a bomber every hour stateside built one more mission every sunrise in England. The wheel never stopped. Keep this picture. A fortress rolled onto dispersal with a tire blown and a wing like a sieve, engines still even. A kid from Kansas stepped up, fresh plugs in one hand, a greasy rag in the other, and told the cooling metal, "Sir, I like my birds coming home." Behind him waited a pallet of parts stamped with American cities. The next launch was already on the board. Bravery without time cannot win. A mother in Detroit folded a newspaper that bragged about Willow Run and asked if it could be true. AB-24 every 63 minutes. It was. The United States turned farms, garages, and universities into a single factory and fed it with steel, oil, and belief. Seattle and Long Beach marched airframes towards sunlight. Dodge packed engines with cereals that followed them like dog tags. Trains and Liberty ships made an iron river to Britain. Out of that river stepped the thing the Luftwaffe feared most, not a new weapon, but more of the same weapon, again and again, faster than loss could eat it. On the line in England, the numbers felt human. 3,000 men to put 210 flyers and 21 planes into the air. Armourers threaded arming wires by touch. Crew chiefs heard a weak magneto at idle and fixed it by noon. Weather sergeants sniffed icing in the cloud deck like rain on dust. Chaplains walked dispersals at dusk and said nothing because the right word is sometimes silence. Every hand made the same promise to strangers. We will be ready when you are. A dictatorship can shine bright in one moment. A democracy can repeat. Over Hamburg, repetition killed hope. Daylight cut rails and current. Night fed flame with wind. Daylight returned to cut the same nerves. Again. Pilots learned flak belts and flew into them because they trusted a system stronger tomorrow. Factory girls in Michigan and Rosie, riveters in California, read telegrams, swallowed fear, and went back to their stations. Their rivets steadied a bomb site in a sky far away. It is an invoice stamped paid. Private First Class Leonard Len Brooks, a forklift driver at a British port, spent a week moving crated right roan 1,820 seconds from ship to flatbed. A storm slammed the key. Len kept forks low and loads tight. 2 days later, a crew in East Anglia taxied on engines he had moved, and a week later those same engines came back with oil like ink and shrapnel bites on the cowls. Len touched the cereal like a farmer touching a calf. He never fired a shot. He helped win a war. To the enemy, the shock became a calendar. Destroy a dozen fortresses on Monday and see 24 on Friday. Bleed pilots in head-on passes and watch the boxes tighten. Order fuel and learn that the rail net you need is dark, the crane you need is dead, the depot you need is ash. A proud Air Force traded aces for time, and time belonged to the other side. A proud city traded courage for hours, and the hours never added up. The facts are not subtle. In the week named Operation Gomorrah, Allied sorties climbed into the thousands and tonnage toward 9,000. Roughly 250,000 homes were destroyed. About 1 million civilians fled. Tens of thousands died on the firestorm night. The United States did not write every number, but it wrote the daylight lines that made night decisive. It paid in aircraft and crews because it believed ending the war faster saved lives it would never count. Pride here is competence with a purpose. The purpose was to break the machine that fed U-boats, bleed a fighter force that had ruled too long, and prove a free nation could do disciplined violence and show mercy the same day. Behind wire, captured airmen gained weight on decent rations because America meant what it said. In the rubble, German medics pulled Americans from canals because decency can survive anything. Crews wrote letters and tried to explain the smell of burnt paint and straight strings on strike photos. Some things you have to feel. Picture a runway at dusk, oil glittering in puddles, a line of fortresses rolling into darkness, while a corporal with a flashlight marks each tail with a soft "go." Behind him, a truckload of spare engines waits under a tarp, marked with an American city's name. In a hut, a clerk adds fuel totals and rations the coffee. On the coast, a ship leans into weather with holds full of more of everything. The enemy can count airplanes. He cannot count a country in motion. The guard at the POW fence spoke first. "Hamburg is finished," he whispered. eyes on the ground, as if truth might shatter if spoken too loud. Lieutenant Jack Moran said nothing. He thought of the canal, the medic's hand, the way a straight bomb string looks when a city has no power to fight fire. The verdict was not a headline. It was a chain of cause and effect, built by men who believed daylight precision could change the physics of war. The United States proved it in 7 days that felt like a season. Did the raids only punish a city, or did they tilt the war? Outcomes answer. U-boat support took a blow it could not hide. Rails, cranes, and power that fed submarine repair were hit in rhythm. Convoys at sea faced fewer hunters as 1,940, 3 bent from crisis toward advantage. Daylight fights bled the Luftwaffe's fighter arm at times, and places it could least afford, pushing the Reich into a replacement spiral it could not climb. A free nation turned factories into sorties, sorties into broken systems into saved ships and pilots who lived to cover invasions. Results, not adjectives. A lead pilot held a run through smoke and trusted the bombardier's voice. When a wingman took a direct hit and rolled out a flame, he kept the box tight so the crossing guns stayed a net. In debrief, he marked flak belts with a stub of pencil and said, "We'll shift 500 feet and go again." He was not reckless. He was American. A just return finish. A statistic that feels impossible belongs here. In one 24-hour window, RAF night tonnage exceeded 2,300 tons. The same cycle carried a U.S. daylight strike. The week total approached 9,000 tons. Roughly 250,000 homes were destroyed. About 1 million civilians fled. Tens of thousands died in the firestorm night. No nation should read those numbers lightly. A free nation reads them as debt paid forward toward convoys that arrived, toward airmen who would later escort over France, toward soldiers who would land on beaches with skies growing safer. The United States celebrated purpose, not pain. The enemy's final shock was quiet acceptance. Battery officers tallied bursts that could not stop the stream. Fighter staffs scraped hours and octane, and sent boys to die in head-on passes that proved only that courage without industry is a candle in a gale. Civil defense men stared at dry hydrants and understood the day had already written the night. Writers who had believed in a different future described refugees moving with uncanny silence. Good men on the wrong side met something larger than bravery. They met a free people organized for victory. The bookkeepers of war wrote a verdict that still startles. Hamburg was perhaps the most devastating single-city attack of the war. After Hamburg, the Reich understood that no wall stops wings and no speech stops schedules. After Hamburg, American crews trusted the machine even more because they watched it learn under fire. After Hamburg, convoys steamed with better odds and airfields in England, trained for bigger days to come. End with a picture worthy of the ledger. A runway before dawn, lamps hooded, oil glittering like black stars in puddles. A line of B-17 seconds lifts into grey exactly where the last lifted, each carrying boys who trust pencils and checklists more than luck. Far away, smoke lies over a river like a torn curtain. Above it, a clear lane opens, thin as a promise kept. The first ship slides into it and holds steady. America has decided to do a terrible, necessary thing with care and skill, and to stop when the job is done. That decision made by citizens, fueled by factories, flown by kids, is why a dictatorship that adored force could not match a republic that mastered it.